Thanks everyone for joining us again. So today's another episode of the Safe As Q&A. It's a rapid fire question set. Today we have someone that I've worked with a little bit in the past. We've spoken a lot in the past. It'd be really cool if you can just give a background around who you are and what you do.
Sure, thanks Ben. I'm Giddo. I'm the head of aviation at Griffith University. My background is I'm a pilot by trade, and I was also a human factors manager in an airline. And now I do research in safety management systems, pilot training, and procedures. And of course, I follow this new view of safety, including safety differently.
So the first question I throw to everyone is, what is safety in your view?
That's a good question. I think safety is a perception of how things go around us. You can apply it to basically any context, organizational or even actually personal safety. So if you don't feel safe, it's a kind of more feeling and sense, you're going to try to find ways actually to go back to that kind of comfort zone. And I think that's the same. It can be applicable to organizations as well. So no matter how much we try to measure, sometimes we try to measure by the absence of safety, not actually safety. I think it's more how people see their work environment in the workplace.
And I noticed you mentioned one of the, I guess we'll call it the lenses of safety that some have is the absence of, and then the opposite of that is the presence of. Do you enter into kind of that debate? Do you have a preference for one over the other, or do you think it really depends on the context?
It depends on the context. Definitely, if you want to talk to companies, of course, possessing actually the vocabulary around the absence of safety helps you to connect with people. But from the scientific literature, it makes more sense to talk about capacity. And there are a few other ones that actually talk about perception and sense and of feelings. We have, in order to talk about the new approach to safety or the new definition of safety, you have actually to tap into the old definition to make sure actually people can understand actually what you are referring to. So, yeah.
And it's interesting when we frame it around the new view. I'm sure James Reason wasn't the first, but he was talking about the presence of back in the 90s and saying, the problem is we're trying to measure the presence of something by its absence. Yeah, okay. So next question comes straight out of your research. In some of your aviation cockpit research, you found emergencies often don't match the quick reference handbook, and it was said to have sort of an if-then logic. And my question is, what tends to break first in procedures under surprise? Is it the content, the assumptions that people hold, or the workflow?
I think all of them. There are some situations in which the content is not quite helpful, and there is very little information, additional information to the pilot or the operator about what exactly it's the context under which that procedure was designed. And there is assumption actually we won't have time actually to complete the procedure, read the procedure in full. But also there is also the situation itself. So there is an expectation in the cockpit where you only show you a particular problem, but in reality, sometimes the situation is much more complicated than actually capture and also designed into procedures.
And continuing with the procedure theme, one of your papers, I loved the title of this paper and I loved the underlying logic. So it was said that using a procedure doesn't mean following it. And the crews often used fragments and other resources rather than a rote application of the procedure. So, following through the if, then, line by line. So what would an effective procedure use look like if the goal is to maximize safe and reliable performance?
I would love to see a more context-dependent procedures, things that can actually be brought to help operators that in a particular context, or actually brought at least their capacity to assess the problem or the nature of the problem, diagnose, and then respond. There is a limitation, of course, because in that particular paper, we analyzed only paper procedures. So you have limitations. You can't actually have, every single procedure for every single possible situation. But with new technology now, I would love to see these, what we call the context-driven procedures. So, the system will help people providing more information and content, given actually the needs in that particular moment.
If we assume that procedures operate as one resource among many, I think the evidence does support that. Your work shows that. If we have other insights or other data streams to draw on, like experience, maintenance, logs, what's the minimum structure an organization must support so procedures generally enable action?
There are many of the resources that we uncover that actually people were using to help them to manage some more complicated situations. They were never designed with that intent in mind. So I think one possibility is for companies to create informal opportunities for people to learn. I noticed, and I saw actually many times when one crew is arriving to an aircraft and another crew is leaving, normally that informal chat it's much more informative than every year going to the simulator to practice a particular practice among of many different procedures. Because in reality, is a simulator also is very limited, so you can't actually train everything, and the training itself is very limited. And these informal opportunities to learn from each other, I think they are extremely valuable.
So you're not talking about just a sort of more formal handover. You're saying that people have their own very informal, like social dynamic interactions where they transfer information, learnings, etc.
Exactly, because you have to select what exactly you're going to tell the other. And what I noticed actually, and that's purely based on my professional experience, is when you hand over the aircraft to the other crew, you're going to call their attention to certain things that are not captured in the manuals or procedures, and it might caught up then later. I'll give an example. I was with a very senior captain. I was doing my flight check, and then he read something in the logbook because the crew told him, look, we're going to have a problem in this, we call it ignition switch, while you're firing up your engine, and just be careful. I noted down in the logbook, and then he went there to check if other pilots have done it the same actually in the past. And then when it was starting up the engine, which normally was the first after duty, and then it didn't actually happen in the way I expected. And then suddenly he changed the channel from ignition A to ignition B. I was like, what are you doing? I was like, oh, no, because this guy actually reported something. And then I saw other pilots reporting the same problem with the engine. So that's why I knew that actually changing force and the change of the ignition switch would help actually to start up the engine, and we wouldn't have to go through a lengthy procedure to, dry the engine and then try it again and so on. And that kind of knowledge never been captured by procedures or manual. So you could read actually all the footnotes of the manufacturer manual, but it was actually something they created on the spot. And again, it's not actually was a critical situation, but it was actually more trying to help the company with the production. So getting the flight on time, and make sure actually you wouldn't have to damage or create a situation where we can damage the engine because of the engine is at, and then we can start again and get actually fire. So all these things actually, no matter how hard we try, we will never be able to capture informal through the formal means and formal structures. So assuming and also be more comfortable in creating environment or a situation where people can informally exchange this knowledge without having to kind of control and measure and capture. I think that's also very, very helpful for creating more resilient organizations.
And this wasn't one of our listed questions, but would you consider those activities as adaptive or capacities as part of that definition? Yeah,
I think so. Yeah, definitely. It's very clear. We have the formal system, the compliant bureaucratic system, but also we have the adaptive informal system that happens in any organizations, whether you like or not. So, but in that system, you can't just capture and then bring to the compliance system. So what I see is creating an environment where you can still have the adaptations happening under certain influence of knowing exactly what's happening. But if you capture and bring that to the formal system, then of course new adaptations will happen. So I'll see is two parallel systems happening at the same time. One that you capture and you try to maintain formalized, but the other one, if you create the conditions for which they happen in a safe way, also I believe that actually combines the resilience that we need with the compliance that are required, of course, by the systems and the structure of the operational system that we have in place.
So your work highlights that adding more steps can be a common but flawed response to we'd call it a procedure practice gap. How should organizations decide what belongs in a procedure versus what should just stay as judgment or expertise?
That's a good question. I don't know. I have an answer for this question. What actually I've done some work with the company I worked for, the airline I worked for, is there was one particular procedure. They put actually that down very detailed way. I think it was 15 pages. And then when I was flying with people, every single person has their own way of doing that particular procedure. And then everybody was looking for a goal. So perhaps, there are some authors like Hale who propose actually we might have 3 different levels of prescription. So like goal, process, and action. Finding the right balance is always difficult, but maybe we can ask people so what they prefer in certain types of procedures or activities.
On digital checklists, you've warned against, I should say, trapping paper into screens. I think that was pretty close to the words or the exact words.
Exactly.
What's maybe 1 or 2 capabilities that would make a digital checklist, better support sensemaking in ill-structured situations? That's a bit clunky, but hopefully you understand.
Yeah. So there are basically, I would say, 2 capabilities. I call it then smart capabilities. So the first one is there are certain tasks that people have to do that can easily be performed by a machine, a calculator, or a digital checklist. For example, calculating the landing distance required, given a certain weight in a plane. So we have to do this manually, and the calculations normally are really, too much. The second one is to help people to see a big picture. So what are the possibility of causes for that particular problem they are facing, or is it actually, what is the nature even actually? Is it actually too dangerous? Is it actually too risky? Should it be acting rather than actually be thinking? So I think these two capabilities can easily be done through a digital checklist.
Now, I have to admit, you're sticking to the time limit so effectively that I wonder, is there any other context you want to add to your questions or your response, I should say?
I'm under the time pressure, right? So. So the idea, actually, if you go back to the problem, is we're seeing usually we call it a digitization of procedures. So everybody is bringing their paper, putting a beautiful PDF, shoving to a tablet, and then that's it. So we're now safe because now we don't have the weight of the paper, and people will know how to figure out how to use the procedure. But lots of studies have shown that there are a lot of changes in terms of how people work when you shift from paper to digital electronic version of that checklist. For example, we lose track of we use normally fingers to navigate across pages, and that is lost when you go to the digital one. The ability of opening multiple pages is lost as well. Sometimes we have your own version, so you highlight, you make comments, and that actually helps you, is a kind of a memory aid, and then you get lost when you have a digital version as well. So, and then the PDFs normally have hyperlinks, so you click on the link and it direct you to another page and so on. But again, it's not the same as exploiting the capabilities of the technology itself. So if you really want to actually transfer from paper to technology, we have to make sure you exploit the technology capability rather than just a PDF in a tablet. And there's so much actually that we can do with technology in a tablet. I mentioned the calculations for pilots, for example. It's normally sometimes quite difficult, not difficult, but it's like demanding. The other ones can be, what are the possible causes for the problem we experience here? Can we organize the checklist or even the normal checklist or SOP in a way that people can click and get more information or contact information about why the designer of checklist is asking you to do X and Y and Z? We can actually build into timers. We are doing things that are time dependent. So all these little things that can actually really help people improve their work conditions rather than just like a PDF. So I find actually PDF is quite a lazy way of digitization, but at the same time, actually people are also not so informed about actually the possibilities of creating really helpful checklists and to help their workers.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that's, now that I'm thinking about it, it seems like it's something that would be easy to overlook around. So I've seen a lot of research and articles talking about the virtues of digitizing, but there's obviously unintended consequences too. Like you've just mentioned some. I've seen research around it's really easy to add extra stuff to a digital versus a paper. And then you look at the research from like healthcare, particularly when they look at cognitive artifacts and how using whiteboards and using paperwork can extend cognition. And I wonder, does some of that get lost in translation when we digitize? Because you mentioned just how hard it is to do markups and flick between pages.
And also share knowledge. So you get actually a paper, you can open the paper, the manual together, and we have 2 or 3 people, and then everybody can see. With a tablet, sometimes it's quite difficult, so you have to zoom, and then the zoom, you lose actually the track of the whole thing. But again, there are other ways around. So that's why digitization is not just PDF. It can be more than that. It can be better than that. So yeah.